Now we turn to consequentialism, specific version, ethical egoism. This is a consequentialist theory because, of course, the idea is that you assess the consequences of actions as opposed to things like virtue, actions, etc. themselves. So, in general terms, ethical egoism is a moral view, a moral theory, and on this view, what you should do is this. You should maximize your self-interest. Of course, this is always expressed from the individual standpoint, so if I'm an ethical egoist, I would say I should maximize my self-interest. This is typically presented in contrast with its main enemy, which is altruism. And these can be seen as, opposites. Altruism is the moral theory or the view that we should not always act in our own self-interest, but we should at least some of the time act in the interest of others. Now, you may be wondering why, putting all those qualifications in there, but this is because we'll talk about one of the most famous ethical egoists, Ayn Rand, although I'm not sure if she's as famous as she used to be big. So altruism is the idea that essentially that you would act in a way that's not always in your own self-interest. Doesn't mean you have to do, make lots of bad choices and hurt yourself. It's that it's not always about, in my case, me. And egoism, again, is that what I should do is act to maximize my own self-interest. So it's in contrast with altruism. To the degree that I'm acting as an egoist, I would be acting in a non-altruistic way. And so these conflict. So why do people find ethical egoism appealing? Well, one thing is, as our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, contended, it seems to be natural for people to act in accord with their self-interest. That, seems reasonable. If you ask people, hey, do you want to do what's in your self-interest? Most people would seem to be inclined to do so. There's also kind of the sciencey thing in terms of the claim that humans are psychological egoists. More on this in a bit. Another appeal to it is, somewhat theoretical, is that it's easy to ask the question of why be moral? Because the usual difficulty in getting people to do moral is they tend to see morality as opposed to their, what they think of as their self-interest. They have to give up things, limit themselves, etc. But in the case of ethical egoism, my self-interest and morality are one. It's not quite it's not quite the case that morality is doing what I want to do, but it is in a way kind of close. Now, ethical egoism, of course, is a moral theory, but we have other things that involve egoism. And of course, some might be thinking, hey, that sounds a lot like egotism, which it does. So what are the differences? So psychological egoism. This is a theory in psychology. It's a descriptive theory. It doesn't say what you should do or shouldn't do, so it's not a moral theory. It's a theory saying what people are supposed to be like. And on this view, or at least on this theory, people are only motivated by what they regard as promoting their own self-interest. That's to say, people only do what they think is going to be beneficial to them. So it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say what you should do. It just says, this is the way, if one accepts this is the way I think people are. And you can be a psychological egoist and not be an ethical egoist. Because you might think that people, although they do, as a matter of fact, are only motivated by self-interest, you might think that that is, not what ethics should be about. Now, not surprisingly, people who believe in psychological egoism, if they're doing ethical theory, they're probably often inclined to be ethical egoists as well. Because if people are only motivated by self-interest, that is to say, psychological egoism is true, then ethical egoism seems to be a viable, perhaps the only viable moral theory, unless you want to have a moral theory in which people have, no motivation to follow it. Now, psychological egoism, again, is descriptive, psychological theory. This is how people supposedly are. Personal egoism is the view that, well, roughly put, it essentially is selfishness, that a person chooses to act in a way that's in their self-interest without concern for other people. And so this essentially is just selfishness. It's not a moral theory. It's not saying this is what should be done. It's simply descriptive of a particular person, their behavior. So selfishness. Now, so what about egotism? With the T in there. So a person who's an egotist may also be involved in egoism, but the difference is this. An egotist is a person who has extreme self-regard. They think a lot of themselves. Now, this is not a moral theory. It need not be selfishness. A person could be an incredible egotist and not be selfish. We often tend to think of people who are egotistical as being, having lots of bad qualities, including selfishness, but that need not be the case. And it's a psychological state. It's simply a person who sees themselves as really awesome and amazing, beyond reality typically, but not a moral theory. So what about the ethical egoism? Well, as I noted before, ethical egoism is a prescriptive theory. It's a moral theory. It says, this is what people should do. So what should a person do? Well, the answer, put very generically, you'd want to look at the particular theories, of course, is that, in my case, I should maximize my self-interest, trying to maximize value for myself. Even when doing so conflicts with others, essentially, roughly put from a moral standpoint, actions matter only insofar as they affect me. Now, I could, of course, consider the effect on other people as being important to me, just like I might be concerned about, obviously, the effects of other people's actions on, like, my truck or, my house or my food. And, if someone blows up my truck, of course, that would be against my self-interest. So a right action for me would be one that maximizes what is of value for me. And a wrong one would be one that generates negative value for me. And each of us, for the ethical egoist, would be operating in that same framework. So you'd look at things from your perspective in terms of what's maximizing interest for you. And I would look at things, of course, from my perspective, what maximizes interest for me. Now, there are many, many theories of ethical egoism out there. We'll look at, oversimplified versions of a couple ones that have been influential in American politics. And then we'll look at a classic one from our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes and see, how these work. Again, these are incredibly oversimplified. So you'd definitely, if you wanted to know more, you'd want to look at more of the original material. So Adam Smith is considered by many to be kind of the founding father of capitalism. Now, we, of course, have Adam Smith's original work, and then we have a revised version. So if you're interested in economics and, the history of Adam Smith and capitalism, you definitely want to look into those details and just not go by, what the popular view is. But anyway, so getting back to our simplified look. So here is how Adam Smith is typically presented in the United States. Again, horribly oversimplified. So that is that individuals acting in their own self-interest in a competitive marketplace, a free market, as it were, will, according to this approach, produce an optimal state for society. So the key here is that you act from self-interest and you're operating in a competitive marketplace. So what's the appeal of this? Well, his claim is essentially kind of that this self-interest will lead to better things for everybody. So the claim is that, and you've probably heard this before if you follow American politics and economics, etc., but the theory is that self-interested competition in this free market will lead each person who's competing, each company, to produce better products at lower prices. So in theory, the idea would be this. Suppose all of us, me and whoever's listening to this, that we're competing, companies. We're producing, say, a new computer or a new social media thing. And the theory would be that as we compete, so for example, if I produce a version intended to compete with what is Twitter or what is now called X, and you do a similar thing, the idea is that by all of us competing, eventually we would have a better product at a much lower price. So we would have, through this competition, a really good Twitter thing, or really good social media thing, or with physical products. If I design, say, a phone to compete with the iPhone and Android phones, the idea would be that by this competition, we'd end up with better phones at lower prices. And so again, the basic idea is that by all of us competing, there'd be better products, lower prices. And Adam Smith also is known for this invisible hand idea. What is that? Well, he's not claiming there's, at least I hope he's not claiming there's like a metaphysical, magical, invisible hand doing all this. But the idea is that the market working, all the people working, competing by self-interest, all of this you looked at as like a whole system, that through this self-interest, this will be good for everybody. So Smith here is actually, in a sense, not arguing that ethical egoism is the thing to do, like serve my own self-interest, but he's arguing in a way for like a broader utilitarianism, more on this later, that self-interest would serve the good of everyone. We'd all be better off. And so it's the system where, again, this is oversimplified, that ethical egoism, the idea that I'm acting in my own self-interest, you're acting in your own self-interest, Bill Gates is acting in his own self-interest, Elon Musk is acting in Elon Musk's self-interest, etc., that we'd be motivated to do what we do. But his claim is that through the invisible hand, this would lead through our individual, roughly put, selfishness to social utility. It'd make things better. And again, this is whenever you hear like a political debate about the free market, this is a standard line, that a free competitive market with people acting in competition will produce better products at lower cost for everybody. Now, critics of this, of course, point out that this seems to lead to social disutility. People point to the example of the Great Depression, which of course largely destroyed the economy, and then of course the various recessions and bubbles and so forth that occur. And of course, one could look at it critically in terms of, do we actually get better products for lower prices? And some people may point to computers saying, hey, not so long ago, a decent computer could run you, a couple of thousand. Now you can get like an incredibly powerful computer for hundreds of dollars. And of course, things, many things are much cheaper. But then, of course, people who are critical may point out to things like the cost of, how the cost of things like internet service constantly goes up. The cost of, houses, rent constantly goes up, as opposed to having, say, rent that is lower with better and better quality renting. One could say this actually, we have lower and lower quality renting at higher and higher prices. And this, of course, is a matter of debate. So that's kind of our oversimplified Adam Smith approach to ethical egoism. Now, Ayn Rand. So Ayn Rand used to be like really famous, but this is becoming somewhat historical now. But back not so long ago, but forever in political terms, there was the American Tea Party, taxed enough already. Obviously a reference back to, to the Tea Party in Boston, etc. And Ayn Rand was really popular with that movement. Paul Ryan, for example, probably never heard of him, but he used to be the Speaker of the House, and he was a big fan of Ayn Rand. And occasionally, you'd see the Tea Party rallies and political events, people holding up signs saying, "Who is John Galt?" which is a reference to Ayn Rand's fictional writings. So Ayn Rand was big for a while and is still, I guess, maybe semi-relevant to American politics, but in many ways far less so. If you look at American politics today, you generally don't hear a lot of reference to Ayn Rand or philosophical views in general. But let's look at Ayn Rand because of historical interest, and this will also probably sound familiar. You probably, perhaps have not heard of Ayn Rand, but you probably heard of the things that she professed. So she has a book called The Virtue of Selfishness, or rather an essay in this book. So oversimplified, and again, you want to go to the original if you want the full details to make sure that I'm giving her fair treatment here, although albeit a very short one. She agrees with thinkers like Aristotle and other classic thinkers that the highest goal human beings is to perfect our abilities and achieve a state of happiness. So sort of out of the gates, she would seem to be presenting, sort of classic virtue theory. The goal is to be all you can be and become happy. And she thinks that, or thought, because she's dead now, that we're morally obligated to achieve this goal. So far seems pretty standard. You're obligated to be happy. Now, she presents as the enemy altruism, and not surprisingly, selfishness as the virtuous view. And part of the intent of this, of course, is it's kind of shocking because we think of selfishness as being a vice. So pretty good marketing. So altruism, which she presents as an ethical theory. Now, there, of course, you do want to look at like particular ethical theories that involve an altruistic view, but she's sort of presenting broadly altruism as opposed to ethical egoism. So she claims that altruism tells us to sacrifice our own interest, and she gets kind of extreme here, that we should sacrifice even our lives for the benefit of others, to sacrifice everything. Now, given this view of altruism, she claims that this is incompatible with this goal of happiness. Why? Well, her reasoning is pretty straightforward, that if a person is engaged in her version of altruism, you're going to be miserable. And in fact, we'll see when you look at utilitarianism, this is one of the objections against a form of utilitarianism, that it seems to require us to sacrifice everything to achieve good consequences, which ends up just destroying us. So that is potentially a reasonable point. So in contrast, though, ethical egoism tells us what? Well, it tells us to exclusively seek our own happiness. So, crudely put, to not be concerned about others, to be concerned about ourselves. Or in my case, not to be concerned about you and others, and to be concerned about my own happiness. So, since ethical egoism leads us to be able to achieve this happiness, and altruism would destroy our happiness, she concludes that ethical egoism is correct and altruism is wrong. And one could use like the metaphor, you may be wondering like why the picture of the mountain climber. I always use the metaphor of a mountain climber to illustrate a review. If you spend all your time trying to get other people to the top of the mountain, and you go up and you help people up, and then you don't reach the top of the mountain of happiness yourself, and you go back down to the bottom, you're going to be constantly running up and down the mountain, exhausting yourself, and dying the mountain, never being happy. But if you focus solely on getting yourself to the top of the mountain of happiness, then metaphorically speaking, you will supposedly succeed. Now, Rond, of course, has faced a lot of criticism over the years, but in terms of her appeal, the appeal seems to be pretty straightforward. Essentially, it's telling people to, look out for number one, look out for themselves, and act in a way that is in their own self-interest, essentially to not help others. And again, back when Ayn Rand was kind of a factor in American political philosophy and American politics, she was used to justify things like not arguing against welfare programs, social programs, etc., because those were seen in a critical way, in the sense that helping others in this way and not acting in one's own self-interest would be bad. It would make everybody miserable. And so, not surprisingly, she was popular then. And again, these days we generally don't hear people mention Ayn Rand, but we do still hear people talking about what you should do is act in your own self-interest, and there's often criticism of being an altruist, wanting to help others. Although, of course, we still do praise altruism. So how did people respond to Rand? Probably in terms of, quick, rapid replies, probably the most serious reply is this, that Rand is presenting a false dilemma. She's presenting two extremes: ethical egoism, which is to act in your own self-interest, and even more extreme is her version of altruism. As I noted earlier, I talked about altruism. I said, like, if you're an altruist, that means at least sometimes you don't act in your self-interest. It doesn't mean that you have to sacrifice everything for others. So there are many, many other forms of altruism where you can act, in your own interest and act for the benefit of others, you don't have to sacrifice everything. And the reason why this is presented as a false dilemma is because, quickly put, false dilemma is a classic fallacy. The idea is if someone does it, if I'm trying to use a false dilemma intentionally, I would present two alternatives as if these were the only two. And typical way they're presented is one of them is presented as being clearly and obviously bad, therefore you should take this other one. And the reason why it's called a false dilemma is because it's false, because those are not the only two options. There are other possibilities. And it works, in a way by a bit of deception. That the idea being, hey, there's these two choices here, this one is terrible, take this one, leaving out all the other alternatives. Now, of course, people can do this not in a intentionally deceptive way. They can do it by accident, where they think there are only two options, but they did not actually check to see if there were more. But it's often used in a deceptive way. So it is true. I mean, if you have to pick between looking out for your self-interest or sacrificing everything that in a way that makes you horribly miserable, then yeah, that horrible, miserable thing is terrible. But there are other forms of altruism in which you can, again, you don't have to sacrifice everything. You could be like nice and some of the time. So that's probably the most serious criticism of her, is that yes, her argument works, but only if you put ethical egoism up against, kind of a straw person, an exaggerated extreme version of altruism, which pretty much no serious moral theorist holds to in terms of who she's attacking. If you look at like John Stuart Mill and Aristotle, they don't advocate that at all. Now, another big ethical egoist is our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes. So we'll turn to Tommy Hobbes as our main example, because he's a important dead philosopher. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.